reassure us all. I wouldn't say that we're out in the clear yet, but at least we're not right in front of the abyss. Many tasks remain to be accomplished, and we are very pleased and happy to welcome you very warmly here in Davos, in your Davos family.
Ja, lieber Herr Schwab, Exzellenzen, meine
Dear Mr. Schwab, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I gladly accepted your invitation also this year because obviously the attractiveness of this World Economic Forum is undiminished. And this forum does not only promise interesting insights and outlooks, but also overviews over the current economic situation and political situation. And there are also overall assessments of overall tendencies, trends, which in such momentous and tumultuous times can be also a great help to us. We now have times where economic growth in almost all industrialized countries has been fairly modest. We had a global economic situation where growth only hovered around 3% worldwide. So if we leave the crisis year 2008-2009 aside, this has been the weakest growth on record. And I'm well aware of the fact that the situation in the euro area, in the European Union on the whole, but certainly particularly in the euro area, has contributed to this fairly modest global growth. This had a lot to do with questions of trust, of anxieties, of fears. Also, how big the political will was actually to reform the euro area, to address the ills besetting us. And I think over the past 12 years, we have indeed made progress in this respect. You have chosen a very appropriate motto, resilient dynamism. How can we get this? In a way, this describes sustainability and sustainable development in different terms. And I think that's exactly what we need to be after, not rapidity, not speed, not dynamism at any price, but also dynamism that is resilient, that can withstand shocks. We in Europe want, and that is something that we are at one in saying in the European Union, we want this European Monetary and Economic Union to be a stability union. And this is the very opposite of an emergency operation. It is an operation that shall lead to sustainability. Structural reforms need to be pursued on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have to pursue policies of fiscal soundness. Both of these, to me, are very closely interconnected. Consolidation and growth basically are two sides of one and the same coin, because only in this way we will be able to regain trust. And the current situation in which we find ourselves can be characterized by saying, well, the factor time is of great importance. We have launched certain consolidation measures. New borrowing has been halved in the European Union, and we also have a number of structural reforms that we launched, but we are more than aware of the fact that the effectiveness of these reforms can only be felt later than the structural reforms have actually been introduced. It's something that we've seen in Germany too. There is a certain time lag of 2 to 3 years until the consequences are felt. And now we have to make the best use of our time and do this in such a way that we don't have an escalation of a political situation, domestic situation, such as in Spain, for example, when you have a youth unemployment of 60%, perhaps particularly among young people, in Portugal, in Spain. We have to see to it that we open up new perspectives and perhaps also introduce certain bridging measures that will then allow those reform processes to take place without unduly disturbing domestic peace. Let me perhaps also say something on the very broad-based discussion that I know has taken place here too. When should one embark on structural reforms? When should one make cuts? When is the most propitious moment from an economic and business point of view? Well, there are many economists who say, obviously, it's much easier to make cuts, much easier to pursue structural reforms when the overall economic situation is somewhat less tense, when you have growth. On the other hand, politically, we have made the experience that you need pressure for pursuing structural reforms. In Germany, too, unemployment had to hit a high of 5 million until there was a readiness to actually pursue such structural reforms. So my conclusion out of this is, when Europe today, as we all say, is in a difficult situation, now we have to embark on those structural reforms so that we may enjoy a better life tomorrow. And obviously, we found new tools, new instruments, those that we adopted all around in Europe, and we also found new instruments of solidarity. The Permanent Stability Mechanism, called ESM. 5 years ago, it would have been completely inconceivable to set up such a permanent mechanism in order to protect the euro. Now we have it. Now it is in place, and that's an excellent message. On the other hand, for financial and fiscal solidity, we have the so-called fiscal compact. This too is enforced ever since the beginning of this year. And there's now a particular point where we have to continue working. So we have improved fiscal consolidation, we have better binding commitments, better tools, we have better mechanisms. We also have, as regards banking supervision, made considerable progress. As of 2014, we will have a banking supervision in place in the Eurozone, in which obviously also other European countries can participate. But what's still lacking, and that's something that we need to do this year, 2013, is to see to it that over the next few years to come, we also have a convergence in competitiveness within the common euro area. So not somewhere where we are sort of accepting the lowest common denominator, but competitiveness that measures itself against the best of us and against the best on global markets, ensuring us access to global markets, because the euro member states and the European member states generally can only grow when they produce goods that can be sold on international marketplaces. This is why international global competitiveness is so important. We are currently talking in the European Union about something that we will do in parallel to the fiscal compact, namely a pact for competitiveness, when nation states enter into agreements with the Commission, where, if you like, they enter into binding commitments to improve certain elements of their competitiveness that are yet not up to par by global standards. Quite often one will have to debate, for example, unit labor costs, research, development, efficiency of administration, ancillary wage costs that fall within the realm of national sovereignty of the European Union member states. So national parliaments would have to give political legitimacy to such agreements, which will then be binding, so that we all know to what extent competitiveness in the euro area will be improved. There's another road that we shall embark on, namely, we should do everything we can in order to ensure increased mobility of our labor force within the European single market. We have barriers of language, we have barriers of portability of social security systems. In this area, the possibilities, the potential of a single market needs to be tapped also for a single labor market. And there's a third thing that we need to do. We have to respond to the question of how this single market, this European single market, ought to look in order to be recognized as an important global player on international markets. So we must not only be inward-looking as Europeans, we also and in particular need to see to it that we are globally recognized and acknowledged players, and that we have companies within our frontiers that can be global players. And here the European Commission and also the European level and administration in general needs to perhaps adjust a little bit more to the global challenges. I expressly say this directed to my colleague David Cameron. You too have addressed competitiveness, seen this as a central issue of ensuring prosperity of Europe for the future. And this is why over this past year and in the years ahead, we should not only address the question whether investors, be it sovereign funds or private investors, how can we ensure then that their trust in us is justified? We, from a European perspective, obviously want to be as competitive as possible to ensure the prosperity of our people. That is our interest, and that is what we have addressed already and what we need to continue to address. We are not yet where we want to be, and we're not yet out of the woods, but a lot actually has happened here that goes in the right direction. One of the big engines of growth of the global economy, and also for us in Europe, is free trade. We have, unfortunately, a lot of protectionist tendencies in the world today. Pascal and me, when we met at the G20 meeting, outlined this time and again and impressed this on us. And we need to do everything we can in order to contain these protectionist tendencies. The Doha round of the World Trade Organization, unfortunately, has not developed in such a positive direction as we wished. So in the future, too, unfortunately, we need to pin our hopes on bilateral trade agreements. And Germany, I can promise you, will be very proactive as regards the conclusion of such free trade agreements. We've now given the mandate of a free trade agreement with Japan, with Canada. We're shortly before conclusion of an FTA with the ASEAN states. We urgently need to come to such agreements. And after decades of failed attempts, we would like to do this with the United States as well, develop such a free trade agreement with the European Union. Quite often, agricultural exports are a bit of a hurdle here. On both sides, but I think we need to do this, we can do this, and we all will benefit. Europe has about 7% of the global population these days. If economic growth can be relaunched, we shall again have about 25% of the global GDP, and we have 50% of global social expenditure. So our prosperity can only be maintained if we prove to be innovative and if we measure up against the best. So let me make one remark that is addressed to Germany quite often these days. German growth is driven by domestic consumption. We've done everything in order to increase domestic consumption, but we are still criticized for imbalances. Now, let us look at the root cause of such imbalances. If we look at unit labor costs in Europe, were we to meet sort of halfway, then we have accepted that Europe will no longer be competitive globally and that Germany can no longer export globally. That cannot be the objective of our efforts. And therefore, surpluses in current accounts also are a hallmark of good competitiveness. And this is not something that we ought to put at stake at any cost. Now, my last remark is on regulation of financial markets. We heard today from David Cameron and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and also our German finance minister started an initiative on this, that this year G8 will look at tax evasion and tax fraud. I think it's an enormously important issue, and I think the regulation of the shadow banking system also needs to play a very important role for the Russia meeting for the G20. We have quite a lot of regulation for our banks. Basel III comes to mind here. Here, actually, we have to be vigilant that the lending capacity that is to boost, after all, economic growth doesn't get too contained, too limited, and I can only hope and enjoin our partners in the United States to introduce this as well. Otherwise, there's another imbalance here. But through better regulation of banks, as regards their the capital that they need to, the capital reserves that they need to have, we also see moral hazard in the sense that people increasingly seem to fly into the shadows of shadow banking. What we were at one in saying when we agreed this at the G20 level, that every financial instrument, every financial product, every financial market needs to be placed under regulation. We are very far from that. I can only call on the financial industry to support us in this, because another bubble that we create, another deep crisis for global business, for the global economy, will be very, very difficult to master. It will be very difficult for our democracies to master, because people will then completely lose trust in democracy. We in Germany had made very good experience in actually placing our hopes in the two sides of industry, that they, in the sense and in the spirit of the social market economy, shoulder their responsibilities, but they will not allow us to make the same mistakes again, and they will not forgive us for making the same mistakes again. So I can only enjoin you to pursue this goal of regulation of international financial markets. I agree with previous speakers here. National banks will not be able to solve the structural problems. They can build bridges. The European Central Bank, for example, contributed to it. But they have also made it very clear, the ECB has made it very, very clear, that only those who pursue structural reforms, and resolutely so, can rely on our support. So structural reforms have to be put in place. We have to place the necessary framework and take the necessary measures to put framework conditions in place in order to generate growth. Thank you very much for your attention.
Frau Bundeskanzlerin,
Madam Chancellor, what you have said reminds me of the fact that we passed the exams last year. We came out of school without failing the exams, so we still have a lot of homework to do. May I ask you then, and I link up to what you said 2 years ago when you were here, and I quote you, 2 years ago you said, the exchange rates should respect the macroeconomic conditions of a country, unquote. And if we take this with regard to competitiveness, do you feel that this would have an influence or hamper competitiveness?
Let me say I am not completely without worries on this. I think through the discussion in the G20, there's more of an awareness of political influences or manipulations of the exchange rate, more sensitivity. The Chinese government actually reacted quite favorably and also responded to our demand with a certain change in their policies. I must admit that I look with a certain degree of concern at Japan right now. For Europe too, it's going to be important that the big injection of liquidity that was given into the markets for the sake of the banks is siphoned off again. But I think the ECB is actually here a very positive force. They're playing a very positive role, and they will see to it that one refrains from a policy of manipulation and that one pursues a policy that actually reflects the situation as it is. If everyone is doing it as is the ECB, I think we would have less problems all over the world, but that's about the extent of my comments.
Since you've touched upon central banks, what exactly are the objectives of central banks? You have the Federal Reserve that has set itself an additional objective. We've seen the more recent developments in Japan. What do you think about the independence? You touched upon it, you alluded to it. Maybe you could go into a little more detail?
I think it is well known that we in Germany, and I share this without any reservation, are of the opinion that central banks should not be the ones who sweep up after politicians have created a big mess. In such a difficult situation as the one that we had in the financial crisis 2008 and 2009 or 2007, it is obviously important for central banks to step in and to help overcoming such a difficult situation. And the ECB did that, actually, exploiting the very limits of its mandate. The mandate is much more limited than, for example, the one of the Fed. The European Central Bank has to see to it that the currency is stable. They don't look at unemployment or growth rates, different from the Fed, which says once unemployment has reached this or that level, we will continue our policy of buying bonds. That's not the policy of the ECB, but liquidity assistance to banks, emergency assistance to banks, that's where the ECB stepped in with great resolve. Looking at the situation where the ECB did quite a lot, I still feel as a politician duty-bound to do my homework, because in the long run, central banks will simply not be able to varnish, to gloss over, macroeconomic difficulties and weaknesses. So we shouldn't now stop in our efforts and relent in our efforts. That's why the ECB said we're only going to continue to pursue buying bonds if countries pursue their course of reform. And that is the right condition to put in place here.
Madam Chancellor, one question still remains unanswered after Prime Minister Cameron's speech today. If the euro is to become the link for interior strengthening, what is this going to do for those countries that are not part of the eurozone?
One shouldn't forget that the euro was, after all, introduced in the expectation that all member states of the European Union would one day become members of the eurozone, that is to say, would introduce the euro one day. The British Prime Minister said something today, yet again, that we've heard quite often, that the British side, at least for the time being, cannot envisage becoming a member of the eurozone. And we have an opt-out here also from the Danish friends, and in two referenda, I believe the Swedish people decided against joining the common currency. What we need to do is that all of possible forms of enhanced cooperation in the area of banking supervision, fiscal compact, enhanced economic coordination need to be exploited and need to be shaped in such a way that they're binding for Eurozone members, but are also freely accessible to those who as yet have not introduced the common currency. And that's so important for the general philosophical outlook, that it's not a closed shop, but it's an open exercise for all of those who wish to be in on this, which was the case, for example, with the fiscal compact, introduction of national compacts. We were able to win over 25 of 27 members, even though 17 at the time only had the euro. And I think that's encouraging. And from other areas where we cooperate, Schengen, for example, as regards freedom of travel, we are familiar with such regimes of enhanced cooperation. So we should look at that without undue worry. At the same time, we should not completely block off the possibility that we still wish for many others to join us in the euro.
Madam Chancellor, Karl Popper, the philosopher, said that far-reaching economic and political and social changes can only be achieved in small steps. This was also expressed in your speech. We have a lot to catch up with in many European countries. You said yourself that the time factor has an important part to play. Do you think that Europe will be able to, in the time available, since other countries are on the move as well, to manage this homework? Do you believe this?
Let me say, I would, well, say I'm optimistic, but under certain conditions. If Europe has seen the sign of the times, if it is willing to look at the big picture, at what's happening at the on the global stage, and draw the necessary conclusions, then I think we have the necessary instruments and tools to be very successful globally. Last but not least, every time I go to China, I am constantly reminded by my partners of the fact that we are the biggest single market of the world. We have after 50% of global social expenditure, but we have after all also 25% of global GDP. So we can do quite a lot with that if we're open, if we don't shut ourselves off against the rest of the world, if we don't become complacent, if we're open to innovation, and if we don't accept it as a given that Europe has some kind of legal claim to be the leading continent in the rest of the world. Our democratic experience, our economic order, the capability of our institutions, also of our national institutions, is actually quite big. And if we don't accept to become ossified, but use this to the best of our people, we have good chances. And if we look at the enormous demographic change that we have to contend with, if we also draw the conclusion that we need to be more innovative, it's a good picture that I see ahead. If we just push this to the back of our mind and don't draw the necessary then no. But I will do my utmost to do that.
And I suppose that is also the wish you would like to pass on to the participants here, that is innovation, creativity and conditional optimism. Any other wishes?
Actually, my wish, well, I'm saying this to investors who are thinking currently, pondering investments in Europe. Central and Eastern Europe has done almost flying below the radar a lot of reforms. We're more talking about other countries that are doing reforms, but don't forget that Central and Eastern European countries made enormous strides as regards reforms. So look at the investment climate in Europe. It has changed for the better. And my second request, we had a previous occasion to highlight this. Our big burden right now is youth unemployment in Europe. Whoever is willing to step up to the plate and give at least a small contribution to opening up a perspective to young people, I can only invite you to do this in Europe. We are welcoming anyone with open arms who gives a piece of hope to young people.
A very warm welcome to you, Madam Chancellor.